Good evening. We'll get started here in just a little bit. If you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat, I'd be great. Okay. Oh, hi, Donna. Welcome. Hi, is it, I'm going to hopefully pronounce it Adelina and Pam. Glad you're here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and then make sure that you can see. There we go. Yes, Pamela, did you have a question? Okay, well, I have quite a bit to cover. Could somebody let me know? And this is I haven't done many of the Zoom webinars. I've been in a lot, and I have done meetings, but let's see. Okay, you can see the screen. Okay, that was my question. So, all right. Great. Thanks, Pamela. All right. Let's see. There we are. All right. Well, good evening and welcome to Historically Well. It's a new program, a virtual program from Varner Hog Plantation State Historic Site, a property of the Texas Historical Commission. If you're not familiar with where we are in Brazoria County in West Columbia. So that's about an hour or so south of Houston. My name is Mark Osborne. I'm the lead educator here at Varner Hog, and I'll be your guide tonight as we explore the history of wellness found within the real stories of the people, both enslaved and free, who lived, worked, and built community over the 130 years of history here at Varner Hog Plantation. As I said, I welcome you to introduce yourself in the chat. I do have it up. I'll be monitoring the chat. So if you have questions, please post them, and I'll try to get to as many as I can answer. And then we should have plenty of time for, oops, I'm sorry. There we are. 4 questions. And then the Zoom is being recorded, and it'll be made available to you. So I have quite a bit to cover, so let's go ahead and get started here. So for those who may not be familiar with Varner Hog Plantation and our history here, I thought I would go through and do a real quick overview for you. So our history actually starts long ago. We usually say 1824, but increasingly we're trying to make sure that we include the native peoples who were in this area long before any European encounters. So, of course, in this area, these were Karankawas. We do have some archaeological record of them coming up the creek, which is now called Varner Creek, here on the property. And then in 1824, that's when the first settler comes, when this is part of still the Mexican frontier. So through 1834, we have a family, the Varner family. That's where we get the Varner name, who came and settled. Martin Varner satisfied his 10 years to receive his land grant, and then sold to another family, an era that we are calling slavery and early Reconstruction, which lasted 1834 to 1869. And that's when we'll meet the Patton family. I'll talk more about them here in just a minute. And it's highlighted because that's the era that we are going to focus on tonight. Following 1869, when it's sold, we have about 30 years of corporate ownership, and then the use of convict labor after the Civil War. The next Historically Well program on the 24th, I'll be talking about convict labor and the conditions that, looking at some of the state reports that came out at that time. Then in 1901, we, for about 57 years, it is now Varner Place. And you're like, well, did the Varners come back? No, that's Governor Hogg, who bought the property in 1901. And then his daughter, the famous Miss Ima Hogg, donated it to the state in 1958. Governor Hogg called it Varner Place because he knew he had a connection through family with the Varner family. And so he went back to the Varner name, while instead of calling it something else during their time. But what we like to say the Varner Place, because at that time, this was a vacation home for the Hogg family. And there were people who lived here and worked here, and we like to say built community here. And so calling it Varner Place encompasses a lot of people, not just the Hogg family. And then, of course, from 1958 until today, it has been a state historic site, first under the Texas Parks and Wildlife, and now under the Texas Historical Commission. Okay, so this era of slavery and Reconstruction, again, from 1834 to 1869, the plantation was owned by a man named Columbus Patton and his family. And there's quite a sordid history that I'll try to get through fairly quickly. They arrived in Texas from Kentucky, bringing approximately 60 enslaved people with them. They bought the full 4,000 plus acres from Martin Varner and began producing sugar. This was a sugar cane plantation. This whole area in lower Brazos, Brazoria County, the Brazos River was before the Civil War, about 45 plantations in this area. This plantation was a middle tier plantation, if you will. They were producing at the height in 1849 about 275,000 pounds of sugar and 22,000 gallons of molasses. A lot of, and that was at the height. In other years, it was, that fluctuated, but that was the highest. Of course, there was subsistence farming and plus some cotton, a two-story sugar mill, and all of the support structures, and 18 slave quarters. So just a note about the photos. So the house photo is of our, what we call the main house. The earliest photo we have, this is, I believe, from about 1880s. So we don't have any images or photos, no etchings, no drawings, paintings of any of the family or what the plantation really looked like. So the photos that you'll see in the presentation are all have either been our modern photographs or ones that are in the public domain that sort of represent what the topic is. This photo, the other photo of this lady, that is Sarah Ford, and that is that's a photo from 1937. I'll talk more about Sarah here in just a minute. What I'd like to do first, before we jump in too far, is talk about, we know that enslaved people created community and took care of each other as best they could within the confines of enslavement. So is there a contradiction to talking about the wellness of enslaved people? And I would say they were still people. They got sick, they got hurt, they had babies, they also endured brutal physical punishments that would require medical attention afterwards. So in the big picture, yes, there was not much wellness, and there was not much concern for individual wellness in the institution of slavery. But when we can look at individuals and find their humanity in how they were taken care of, it helps us understand more about their conditions. You'll see that we do have a historical record that is fairly unique, and I'll explain that here in just a minute. And all plantations in some way were the same, but all plantations were very different. So the way each plantation was run, the way enslaved people were treated varied greatly across, not just Texas, but the entire South. So sometimes it helps also to help us fill in the blanks. I may look at the broader historical record. So we'll see that here in just a minute. Okay. All right. So the estate records that we have. So in 1854, so for about 20 years, Columbus Patton, he was, I think, there were several brothers. It was a fairly large family. He ran the plantation, but in 1854, he was taken to court and by his family and put on trial, if you will. It was a sanity hearing. He had been acting very erratically, and he was declared non compos mentis, or insane, and he was taken to an insane asylum in South Carolina. What that set up was an administrator was appointed for the estate. His name was John Adriance. He was a local merchant and businessman, and he became the administrator for the estate. 2 years later, in 1856, Columbus dies in South Carolina. His will is found and recorded in court, and a lot blows up. That's a whole other session. We can talk about what happened while it was in probate. What we're concerned with tonight is the extensive record keeping that Adriance had to do as administrator and then executor of this property while it was in probate. So we are very fortunate, if you will, to have these records. They don't tell us a complete story. It is an accounting, basically, but it helps a lot for us to gain some more insight into the lives of the enslaved people. One thing I would, at this point, I'd like to just make a caution that we are going to have to talk about some subjects that might not be appropriate for all ages. I would recommend this, probably some of what we're going to talk about for ages of 13 and older, but I'll leave that to parents. And the other note is, from here, I'm going to be referencing the Patton Plantation or Patton Place. That refers to this 35-year history, in place of calling it Varner Hogg, because that gets very confusing. Okay. All right. So what were the material conditions on the Patton Plantation? As with most plantations, the enslaved people received a ration of corn and cornmeal and some kind of pork, usually a salt pork, whatever was left over that wasn't cured and that the white family ate. Um, it was adequate calories, but it had limited vitamins and minerals. Often enslaved people had vitamin A deficiencies, calcium deficiencies, even iron deficiencies, leading to anemia. What we do know through some records is that on this plantation, the enslaved people were given a plot of for a garden plot where they could grow other vegetables like potatoes, probably a lot of greens, root vegetables and greens. They could not hunt, they could capture wild game, and they could fish. So the creek provided some fish. On this plantation, we have descriptions of the 2-room brick cabins with wood floors. There could be up to 7 people in a 12 by 12 room. So there were 2 rooms with a fireplace in the middle. We only now have we've only been able to uncover the foundation of one of those slave cabins. The clothing, pretty typical. It was cheap, coarse materials. Unlike some other plantations that I've read about, there was a shoemaker on site who could keep shoes repaired, and so I would say it's pretty evident that that on this plantation the enslaved people had shoes most of the time. But the work was hard and at times very dangerous, especially working in the sugar mill. So we're first going to look at some, if you're familiar with the slave narratives, we have 2 for this plantation, and I should mention that this photo is a modern photo that is part of that we have, but it was a woman who was enslaved on the plantation. Her name was Judah Smith. And we learn about Judah through 2 slave narratives. And so one is Sarah Ford. That was her photo earlier in some of the slides. So these were narratives that were gathered during the Depression, the Works Progress Administration. She was interviewed in 1937 while she was living on the east side of Houston, now what is the trendy Edo area. She was probably between the ages of 7 and 10 at the time of emancipation, which would put her in her late 70s, early 80s at the time of her interview. Anthony Christopher, he was also enslaved on the Patton plantation. He lived very close to Sarah in Houston, and he was probably about 14 at the time of emancipation. So he was probably in his mid to late 80s at the time of the interview. But Sarah tells us that, and I quote, if we got sick, we call Mammy Judy. That's what they called Judah Smith. She was the cook. If we got real sick, they would call the doctor. But if it was a misery in the stomach or just a flux, Mammy Judy would fix up some Burvine tea or horsemint tea. And then Anthony Christopher, talking about his memories of the Christmas party that they were allowed to have in the sugar mill, that if the children ate too much, then Judah would be able to get some red oak bark tea to help settle their stomachs. This actually took me on a small rabbit hole to learn a little bit more about healing plants. This is not my area of study, but it has been interesting to learn more about these plants and the way that they were used. These are just a few. If anybody who's listening knows about medicinal plants and how this how they can be used, I would love to get your comments and questions. All right, so let's begin with women's health, and I'm going to quote from Sarah Sarah's narrative. Um, she talks about her mother telling her about life on the plantation. Um, so quoting Sarah, she said, her mother said, "The white folks don't let the slaves that work in the field marry none. They just put a man and breeding woman together like mules. If the woman don't like the man, it don't make no difference. She better go or they gives her a hiding." So just stop and think about that. I won't go into great detail, but if we're talking about women's health and women's wellness at this time, this was physically unwell, but also if we can imagine how psychologically unwell this was for women at this time. If you know anything about the history of slavery, you know that how women were treated. Um, of course, it was illegal to marry. Slaves could not marry in Texas. It was illegal. But we do find family units in our records. So like Sarah's parents, Mike and little Jane was her name. We have a family with the last name Chris. We have an Edwards family. We have an Austin family. And then there were other units that then lasted after emancipation. They actually remained family. And after in the 1880 census, you find many of these families still living together in Brazoria County. Of course, childbirth could be extremely dangerous, both for enslaved people and the white family, the women in the white family at this time. And it could be dangerous for both the mother and the child. Many of the births could be handled by enslaved midwives like Judah, who would know how to uh, help a woman through childbirth, and especially when what Sarah calls the going down pains is how she referred to a woman going into labor. But our records also indicate that doctors were frequently called to the plantation to deliver babies, and not just for what were difficult births. It really seems like they were called more often, even for, forgive me, sort of a normal, a regular birth. But there are some instances where women had very difficult births. And two of the women that I'd like to point out, and this is why these records really help. So today, for another project, I was looking at the 1850 census and the slave schedules, which are just ages, and there's no humanity, there's no names. And so for us to be able to look at a name and at least have a name to go with an enslaved woman, it really helps connect with them. So I'd like to talk about Angie. We don't know her age, but she gave birth on December 30th, 1864, to a little boy. And the doctor charged $26 for the visit. And he had to come 2 times. There was normally it was a $3 or $4 charge, but he had to charge $20, which, excuse me, maybe says she was having a hard time. He had to stay and really help her. Then there's another woman named Jane Otis, and again, we don't know her age. She gave birth on March 25th, 1858, and the doctor only charged $4 for the visit and the delivery. He had come on March 4th and 5th to see her. Then something happened, and this is where the hole is in our records. We know she spent 2 weeks at his office, and he charged $20. We don't know when it was. The entry in the records is April 24th, 1858. What her condition was, unless we could get to the the doctor's records somehow. We won't know exactly. Occasionally, there's an actual notation of what the illness was, but we do see her on November 18th, an entry where she's fitted with a pessary. And so a pessary, if you may or may not know, today it mostly refers to a contraceptive device for women. But what we think is that it also was used to, if there was a prolapse of the uterus. So that especially coming after a visit that long, she was having real trouble. And so that was what was done was to fit her with that pessary. Something else that Sarah tells us about the women on the plantation is that the women who had little children, she says, they don't have to work so hard. They were allowed to work around the sugar house or the sugar mill. And about 11 o'clock, they quit and then cared for their babies till about 1 o'clock. And then they would work until 3 o'clock and quit to finish and to go take care of their babies. So that's an interesting insight to, a more part of a woman's life on the plantation. Now, so the next ones that we see are, unfortunately, a couple of breakouts of venereal diseases on the plantation, which it was probably not that uncommon, but in the records, we have in March 1860, a young woman, about 26, who is listed with syphilis. And I feel like I almost have to apologize to her spirit that this many years later, we're talking about this woman's venereal disease, but it all goes into to learning about them. Then in March 1865, an enslaved man named Scipio, he was a cooper, so he built the barrels that the sugar was shipped out in, and he's listed with gonorrhea. But then in May of 1858, and again in late summer, there are gonorrhea outbreaks that are pretty widespread. A lot of people are listed with in the record books having it. I'd like to stop here for just a minute, because usually when you start talking about things like, especially syphilis, you may have questions about experimentation and what I call othering of Black bodies, and the experimentation that was done on enslaved people. It did happen. There is no recorded evidence on the Patton plantation through anything that we've seen that anything like that happened. So, and again, I should say that's in the recorded evidence. If it did, we just don't know. So that bears more research. All right. And then there's a lot of other ailments, everything from tooth extractions, if you can imagine. And so this is a tooth extraction being pulled, a tooth being pulled by a doctor. So that had to have been pretty severe. I would imagine that, a tooth that needed to be pulled, there was probably somebody on the plantation who could go in and pull a tooth. To call a doctor in and have a charge for pulling a tooth, it had to be pretty bad. We have instances of stitches and burns. Probably it doesn't say it specifically, but it was very, very common to get burns in the sugar mill, running that hot sugar syrup through the process. And then there's some instances of trismus or tetanus and lockjaw, some amputations that had to be made, fractures. And then we come to the only listing of a mental disability that is in the records. And there was an enslaved man named Tom, who he appears in the records in 1858 for treatments first received as a child. He was about 9 years old. It doesn't say what he was treated for. But then in 1857, in the inventory, so he's listed twice as, and I quote, foolish and unsound. Sarah actually mentions him. She talks about the shoemaker, but then it reminds her about this other man named Tom, who refused to wear shoes, and so we see him in several records. And then, unfortunately, there are some instances where the physical health of an enslaved person is noted. And in one case, they were actually, oh, sorry about that. They were examined prior to their sale. And so that is a reality of looking through these records. And so I thought we'd look at a fairly extensive record of a woman named Harriet in 1858. She was about 29, and from August 31st of 1858 all the way, actually almost all the way through 1859, this poor woman is sick. Something is happening. She visits the doctor between August and September. She visits him 4 times. Receives an anodyne liniment, or it was like a pain reliever, a topical pain reliever. And then you can see she had an abscess lanced and given an iodine tincture for an antiseptic. And then in November, she's treated 8 consecutive days. We don't know what for, it doesn't list it. It's just the 8 days that the doctor came to the plantation. Then after the first of the year, she has another abscess lanced. And then the poor woman, after going through all of that, then she has a tooth pulled as well. And then there's just multiple treatments for the rest of the year. So this, 29 in 1858, it wasn't a 29 like today, but still she was young and going through some really poor health at that time. So what were some of the other treatments? We've mentioned a couple of them. Some of these are kind of old-fashioned, and I had to look them up, like an antibilious pill. You can see in the photo there from the Smithsonian. So these were liver pills. They treated a lot of things, but one label that I read, I have a feeling because of the diet, these were used as a laxative to cure constipation. There's several instances of administering quinine, which meant there was malaria outbreaks. And then something called a vermifuge. This was being given to some children, and when I looked it up, it's for worms. It's like a deworming for intestinal parasites. Many liniments and salves, including turpentine. And of course, there is so much written about laudanum and how it was used and abused eventually. So these are very expensive, and I should go back to the antibilious pills. It was just a small package of them. It is listed as a large box, so they needed a lot of those. And most of these treatments were done on site. So there is a doctor. His name was, all we have our initials, R.R. Porter. He's coming here very frequently. That points to the possibility that there was a plantation hospital on our site. We don't have record of that. Nothing in the records point to a hospital. Our other site that we manage, it's the Levi Jordan site, which is just west of us. there are records of a plantation hospital on the site. So probably because that site was further away from a town than we are. We're only about 2 to 3 miles, depending which direction you go. It would have been about 2 or 3 miles to get into town to a doctor's office, and for that doctor to travel out. So again, it's something that we'll keep combing records, and we may find out that there was a hospital on site. Now we have to turn to another reality of enslavement on a plantation, and that was physical and psychological punishments. So both Sarah and Anthony, and what I'd like to take a second, if you can imagine, so I mentioned that at the time of emancipation, Sarah was between 7 and 10 years old, and then Anthony was about 14. So if you can imagine these children, they are speaking about this firsthand. Sarah so her father was Mike the tanner. He ran away quite often. One time she said he was gone for about a year. He was able to connect with a German family who allowed him to work with them tanning hides. And when he finally came back to check on Sarah's mother and Sarah, he was caught and punished in a very brutal way, being tied up, having hot grease poured on the back, and then whipped. And then she describes all of this, and chained in the stockhouse with no food. What we don't know is how those wounds were treated. And looking through the dates, we don't know when Mike was punished in this way to know. There aren't many references for him as far as treatments. What we can imagine is someone like Judah knew how to fix up salves and to put on these wounds. They knew how to treat them. And then there's another description of Adam, and we'll talk about him in just a minute. And then finally, it is final. Just as people lived, they died, and so there aren't many references to deaths on the plantation, but there are two that are of particular interest. One, both entries are from May 28th, 1856, and again, these are records that John Adriance is keeping to present to the courts, to report regularly to the court about what's happening on the estate. So in this first one, the petitioner would represent, so there were two women that passed away. One of them is very significant, Maria, the enslaved woman named Maria, who was about 42 at the time. When Columbus died, and in his will, he didn't free any of the enslaved people, but there were two men and two women that he provided for. And one of them was Maria. She was an enslaved domestic worker at the house. And she was to receive $100 per year. And she could live wherever she wanted to without being leased out. And so that's pretty. We don't know what she died of, but it's pretty significant that she was taken care of like that, and within a couple of years. Well, actually, just right after Columbus died. And then we get back to Adam. So Adam was another enslaved man who ran away quite a bit, it seems, from what we can pull from the records. The people were hired to go out and capture him and get him back. And then the last time, so the court had agreed that Adam could be sold. He was too much trouble. He was causing too much trouble. so to speak. And then there's this entry that they didn't sell him because he ran away and lost his life. And so you can, we don't know how, if, you whatever way it was unfortunate, as he tried to, try to find some freedom. And then there is one more, and it is, I couldn't put anything else with this one because it leaves you really wondering what went on. And I think we need to do more research into this time period about the loss of, and I quote, small Negroes, without knowing the exact number and quality so lost. This one, I try to be as impartial as I can, but I can't get the image. Is Adrian's talking about small children who were dying, and what was happening? I looked. There's no mention of, could it have been something like dysentery, or I looked for yellow fever. This was not one of the years that I could find where there was a real epidemic, a yellow fever epidemic. So this one is puzzling, and it really jumped off the page at me. And then I'll finish up because what we try to talk about here, and what we are working to talk about more, is the lives of enslaved people improved. Once there was emancipation, but how much did it improve? And those effects, what I'm calling those lingering effects of slavery. And so I went in and tried to find what has been happening with African American health since emancipation. And this one article in the Harvard Gazette, a woman was speaking at an event, and she claims it's barely improved. Part of it is because there are enduring stereotypes. I talked about othering earlier, and that seems to continue. Shockingly, as recently as 2016, she cited a study that medical students were learning that African Americans feel pain differently than white people, and that their lungs don't have the same capacity. And so she also pointed of the higher Black mortality rates that because of the lack of access to healthcare. And that can be sometimes hard to imagine. I live in Houston, so I live where the largest medical center in the world is, but that doesn't mean all African American people have access to healthcare. And the most shocking thing that she pointed out is, because it hasn't improved, that there is a misguided notion that somehow it gets twisted that slavery was actually better for Black welfare. And please know, that is not me saying that. That is something she pointed out. I don't know her source for that, but it's just one of those weird ways history gets turned around sometimes. So I hate to leave it on that note, but I hope you've enjoyed it. One thing, she quoted Martin Luther King Jr., that of all forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane. So I hope you have enjoyed, at least appreciated a look at one plantation, and the way that enslaved people were, their illnesses, but also how they were treated, and some insight through our records of their wellness. So just real quick, we do have some other programs coming up. If you have little ones, you can join me actually Monday. It'll be nice to stay inside. I won't be on the front porch. We are expecting snow of all things on Monday, but I have a program called Front Porch Stories where it's our virtual story time. We'll be doing a collections Zoom in on next Tuesday, where we go to our curatorial facility and really focus on one artifact. And then beginning February, this February 23rd through the 27th, we have our week of Remembrance, which is a week to, I showed you some names of the enslaved people, but it's our opportunity to find ways to speak all their names during this month. And then the next Historically Well, I'll be talking about convict labor. So let's see, I'm going to stop sharing, and I welcome your comments, and thank you so much for joining in on this. I hope it was useful information, and a real insight into at least one Texas plantation. So if you have questions, I'll try to answer, and I'll be honest. So this was set up. I'll tell you a little insider. This was set up in Austin for me. I would really like to see you. I would next time I'll ask if I can make sure I can see your faces. That I always appreciate that. But I also appreciate you. Well, thank you so much. Oh, hi, Lori. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Life, oh gosh, life expectancy. So it really ranges. Thank you for that question, Mark. So in our records, we have some enslaved people who were in their 80s. Even before emancipation, they had been with the Patton family for years. But then you have children who are passing very, very young. So it wasn't long, and if you take the outliers out, it could be a short life. I think it was all in what plantation you were on, how you were being taken care of, how you took care of yourself and your family unit, the other enslaved people that formed your family, if you will. So really great question. Thank you so much, CJ. Physically handicapped. I don't have evidence. I don't have anything in our records about how. I will have to do some more research on that. But if we think through that, I would. They were probably given other tasks. For instance, we do have that at least one instance of a enslaved man having a leg amputated. What they probably did was give him other kinds of work. We have Tom, who with a mental disability, but he, I would stop at believing that they were, for lack of a better word, thrown away. I would hope not. So this is when there's certain language that gets a little tricky. So always we have to remember that, unfortunately, enslaved people, they were an asset. That's how they were treated. They were part of the property, and if you could still get some kind of work, you would get some kind of work out of them, whatever they could do to help out on the plantation. Great questions, Mark. Gloria, are you aware of the resource, the price? I have heard of that book. I have not been able to read it. Thank you for bringing that up and sharing that. Yeah, I think I've got that on a reading list, so I'll definitely check that out. Thank you. Enslaved persons who had lived. Oh, yes, Eric. So what happened to some of them after? So what I failed to mention, and I have to give a big credit to, she's actually an associate professor of American Studies at UT Austin now. But back in 2000, she compiled the records into a usable, she went person by person, and found every mention of them in the records. But she also went to the 1880 census and tried to find them after emancipation. And she found many of them. The ones I can tell you, so Sarah's family, for instance, her at the time of emancipation, her father was, he wanted to get out, and he was asked to leave after emancipation, but he moved to nearby in a town that's now called East Columbia and set up, I'm not sure if he continued being a tanner, but he built a home, he had a farm, he was working. Sarah tells us about them living there. And unfortunately, in 1875, there was a major hurricane that came from more toward Matagorda, and it came around this way. And both of her parents were killed in that hurricane in 1875. Also the night she was giving birth to her first child. We know from Anthony's narrative, he went on to work on the railroads in Texas, and traveled extensively with all the railroad building that was happening after the Civil War. The other one that we know some about, and they'll watch our website. I'm sure I'll be doing a program about another woman. Her name is Rachel. She went by Rachel Bartlett or Rachel Patton. Fascinating story. I won't go into all of it right now. We know that she continued to live in the area. So yeah, and then we lose her as we do. There are quite a few, and I think because of their age by 1880, we lose track of them after that. We have a project going on right now that has been a little slow to start with all of the COVID, the pandemic. It's called the Descendants Project, the Brazoria County Descendants Project, and it is. We are really excited. We will be asking descendant communities in Brazoria County to bring us artifacts. It'll be a digital repository of letters, business documents, recipes, photographs, and we're hoping that with that project we can get even more information about the descendants and what their lives were like after emancipation. Let's see, I have another question. Does the enslaved people in Texas include any other races? That's a very interesting question. On our plantation, we don't, it was possible that Native peoples could be enslaved. I mentioned the 1850 slave schedules. I looked up the ones for the Patton Plantation. And honestly, I haven't been able to find an answer. That there are listed some under race, there are listed Mexican slaves. I was shocked. I don't know that. I don't know how that happened, if it was an indenture or if it was, I mean, that's a whole subject in Texas, whether it was indentured servitude versus slavery. So there's a possibility, yes, that there possibly were Mexican people who were enslaved. How that happened, what they were doing, I don't know that right now. So it's another avenue of research. For every one thing we do know in our history, there's probably about 10 things that still need a lot of research. Let's see, Gloria. Presentation about roots makes me wonder if medical skills learned priests, doctors survived. I'm sure they have. I can imagine that knowledge continued to be handed down through generations. I would not be surprised if there are African American families today who know how to make these teas for their families. I think that would be a wonderful thing to know. I thought where you were going, so much of this knowledge also came with them from Africa. So, they were doing this for, thousands of years before their encounters with Europeans. But also in the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, the seeds from Africa were brought with the enslaved people. So and then they encountered Native American Native peoples and their use of herbs and roots, medicinal plants, and then that meshed and interacted also with Europeans and their knowledge of using medicinal plants. So great. Let's see. Do we have any more questions? Well, let's see. Make sure I didn't miss them up here. I think I've got them all. Well, I really appreciate you being here. This was we did a couple of these and it was a slow start. So I really appreciate you tuning in with me. And this whole new world we live in, this virtual world, we'll continue these. Even if I can do them in person one day, I'll still continue to do them virtually. And I hope you continue to follow us. Please, whatever social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, kind of keep up with us. You can always go to our website to see what we're up to. We have a lot of things going on right now, and there's some really exciting things happening at our other site, the Levi Jordan Plantation. So if there aren't any other questions or comments, thank you, Gloria. I appreciate that. So I will sign off. Wish you a great evening. And did I introduce myself, Pamela? Well, let me finish with that one more time. Yes, I am Mark Osborne. I am the lead educator here at Varner Hog Plantation, and this has been great. I really appreciate you joining me tonight. So I'll talk to you again. Stay well, and we'll talk soon. All right. Good night, everybody. Oh, yeah. Okay. Bye.